Hi guys, the job of right-wing newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Express is either to push Conservative governments in a certain direction or cheer them on. It's not about holding those in power to account, so when a new administration takes over, they automatically switch to attack mode. Case in point, the current Labour plan to deal with the strikes. It's the job of government to avoid strikes where possible, but instead of welcoming the end to most industrial action, right-wing newspapers are calling Labour weak or in the pocket of union bosses. Here a guy from the Daily Express believes the Tories instead had the right approach. By the way, why the hell is Sky News inviting somebody from the Daily frigging Express on?
As we can see, £14 billion bill for Keir's shabby union cave-in.
Isn't it interesting how the papers have shifted so quickly when Labour has moved from opposition? No, it was almost instant. So this is obviously the right-wing Mail saying it's going to be an absolute disaster to pay normal people in normal jobs, in jobs that are all in crisis. We can't get enough teachers, we can't get enough nurses, we can't get enough GPs. But why would we want to pay them fairly? That's basically the line. They're talking as if we are going to cripple the country by paying these people who... It's very much talking about the unions. It's the enemy. They're not normal people. We're not related to these people. They're not everyday people who are actually struggling with the cost of living crisis, just like all of us. I think it's very divisive, this debate, because I think if you're on less, then you would wonder why a GP needs to be paid more. Mm-hmm. But I think we've absolutely got to remember that our public services are on their knees and we cannot recruit people into these roles that we absolutely vitally need to fill.
And it's not just recruitment, it's also about retainment. In order to keep doctors and nurses and teachers and others in the system, you need to pay them more. We've already heard stories about nurses leaving Britain to go to work in Australia or in Canada, where the pay is better and the conditions are better. So it's not just about recruiting, and she's completely correct here, but it's not just about recruiting, it's also about retaining staff. And it's extremely difficult if you're not willing to pay them decent wages, but also about working conditions, because many people are burnt out. Even if they did get a pay rise, they'd say, it's not worth it for me. There are too many hours. I'm overworked. I need to do something else.
Why are they doing that? Why are we in this position where, and let's not forget, this was not a strike-free past couple of years. It's been an absolute disaster for the country. So what is the alternative? Do we continue to not pay them so we can't recruit into the jobs, so the public services keep collapsing around them? Or does the new government try and find a way forward, which the previous government absolutely failed to do and left us in this utter mess?
Well,
it's been a disaster so far.
I think the solution really was what the previous government was aiming for, which was, yes, we will negotiate pay, but that has to be hand in hand with reforms around working practices and getting greater productivity.
Productivity? We're talking about GPs here. GPs that are overworked, that are burnt out. What the hell are you talking about productivity? I always find it funny when you have Tories and Tory supporters talking about productivity. How productive were the Conservatives? They ran public services into the ground. They trashed the NHS. And now they're and of course they were saying, well, we're not going to pay doctors and nurses more unless we get higher levels of productivity. People are leaving. The amount of work they're trying to deal with has increased. And you're saying we need to squeeze them a bit more, get another few hours out of them. They're people, they're not machines.
In return for that, these deals, as Aslef said the other day, have come with no strings attached. So we're not getting anything back. And there are some very arcane working practices within these industries that are well past their sell-by date. And Labour's not getting any guarantees for reform on that.
The job of the government is to try and avoid strikes where possible. Look, we had the Tories. They were in charge for 14 years and there were strikes. Not all of those 14 years, but mainly towards the end, because they were picking fights with the unions. They weren't actually interested in making sure that the trains ran on time. They were not interested in having enough doctors and nurses to bring down the waiting list. It was political. It was ideological. We've realized that, as was pointed out earlier, we can convince the public that these trade unions are not ordinary people. Look, trade unions are there to represent their members. It's not within their scope to improve society. Many of them want to improve society. They're not just limited to protecting workers' rights. But their primary goal is to protect their members. So, of course, if they see an opportunity to create disruption that will help them achieve their goal, they're going to do that. That's why government is supposed to be avoiding that, to try and avoid that problem by providing them with decent wages and better working conditions. The right wing tried to paint this in a very different light.
And arguably, yes, of course there were strikes, and I totally appreciate that pay has been flatlining for too long. But of course, the unions had a major incentive to keep strikes going for longer than they needed to, because they knew an election was around the corner, and if they could get Labour in, they could get much more for fewer demands for reform in their sector.
They didn't get Labour in. The country voted for Labour because they didn't want to vote for the much weaker alternative. And you cannot possibly, after more than a decade and years, say, no, this is what we're aiming for. They had their chance. They massively failed. And Labour is now, whoever come in, this is the mess they were dealt with. And we have to move it forward. I can't bear this conversation after less than 2 months of Tories kind of going, oh, let's do it this way. You had your chance. You messed it up.
All right.
Well said. Like the Conservatives now, all you're hearing from the Conservatives is, if we were in power, we would fix this. If we were in power, we would do it this way. You were in power for 14 years. You ran the NHS into the ground. It's so frustrating. And we're seeing Tory candidate who wants to be leader after Tory candidate who wants to be leader come out now and say, you know, like Robert Jenrick, well, if I was in charge, I would bring down immigration. You were immigration minister. You weren't the Secretary of State, but you were the immigration minister. Now you're talking about, well, if I was in charge. Priti Patel the same. If I was in charge, I would do it this way. I would have done it that way. The right-wing media are just there, it seems, to criticise the new government. So whatever they do, it's wrong. If there are strikes, it's wrong. If there aren't strikes, it's wrong. They're not there actually to hold the government to account. Because they're partisan. When the Tories were in charge, wonderful. Boris doing a great job. Liz Truss doing a great job. Rishi Sunak doing a pretty good job. You know, when it comes to immigration, maybe not so good. But generally, everything that the Tories did was positive. Everything Labour will do is negative. If they're avoiding strikes, it means they're selling out to their donors, the union bosses. If they're not dealing with strikes, why aren't they dealing with strikes? So it's damned if you do and damned if you don't. But the problem, of course, comes down to the fact that if jobs are not paid well, if the conditions are not good, people are going to either go on strike or they're going to quit. And in either situation, the government needs to do something about that. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think about all of this. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot.